So let me introduce him. He got his BA from UNLV, Las Vegas, in physics with a minor in chemistry and math. And then he went on to Harvard to work with Kang Ni. And I guess his thesis title was Biomolecular Chemistry and at sub-microkelvin temperatures. And then he was a postdoc at NIST and the Ion Storage Group for about 3 years until he came here, and he just started this fall. So let's have a good screen for him. Now he's building a lab, and his lab, he employs quantum techniques and for understanding and controlling chemistry at the quantum level. He's using techniques to prepare samples of molecules at temperatures approaching absolute zero and in definite quantum states, which I guess he'll talk about a little bit about today. These ultracold molecules greatly enhance resolution of spectroscopic probes and chemical reactions. The studies revealing intricate details in the structure and dynamics of seemingly simple molecular systems. That's why we can hopefully follow if they're seemingly simple. The fundamental chemical insights gained through these research serve to advance a range of practical applications, including synthesis, quantum computing, and material science. So you take it away.
Right. So this just put clips on. Okay.
Yeah, we still have lunch, by the way.
All right. So am I coming through okay through Zoom?
Yep, you sound great.
Okay, thank you. All right, yeah, thanks for the very kind introduction, Wendell. I just have one correction. My thesis is on bimolecular reactions, not biomolecular reactions. I know I'm like kind of not quite the, fit the mode of physicists, but I don't stray that far away. But okay, so it is my great pleasure to be giving our final JQI seminar this semester. And sort of want to start the slide with a meme. This original content of the meme is that we got a sheep here hiding amongst a herd of llamas, and they just don't recognize that he's a sheep. And of course, I have to sort of kind of correct this meme to suit my situation, where I am trained in physics. I have some knowledge, some limited knowledge in chemistry, but I was able to fool the chemistry department into hiring me there. So I'm sort of
giving you tenure, so maybe
oh yeah, exactly. I don't think my colleagues are. Don't point them to this talk on YouTube. I don't think my colleagues are here, so I can make all the chemist jokes that I want to. So yeah, I started January 1st this year, so this is day 126 of my time here at UMD. So now after the joke title slide, I want to give my actual title slide. I'm going to tell you a story on using the power of ultracold molecules to precisely probe molecular dynamics. I've sort of updated my title a little bit. You used to say chemistry instead of molecular dynamics, but I sort of want to expand upon that term. And we'll talk about how those two terms are related. Right. So I'm going to talk about my PhD research from concurrent Ni's group at Harvard and some of my research during my postdoc from NIST in Boulder, Colorado, under the advisement of James Chow and Didi Leibfried. Okay, so I sort of want to start with a slide, and this is just, it came out of a conversation between me and Alicia. So this, all credit is due to Alicia. So we're talking about molecules, and Alicia told me why she doesn't like molecules. So her argument is that on the complexity scale, we have things like atoms where they're very simple. We try to make them as similar to a two-level system as possible. And we can get really good control over these systems, and we can understand just about everything that goes on in them, right? On the other end of the complexity spectrum, we have solid-state systems where there are too many particles involved, so there's no hope in understanding things on the individual particle level. So you understand them through collective behaviors, and you use approximative methods. And there are sort of well-defined ways to treat both of these cases. Molecules sort of awkwardly lies in between these two systems on the complexity scale. right? So it is, a little too complicated to qualify for this simple description. But you'd still want to describe things precisely. So you'd want to describe them as precisely as possible and try not to use approximative methods. So that actually means, that they're very complicated. But this is sort of where I like to be. This is my comfort zone. First of all, you notice that, molecules really acting as a bridge between atoms and solid state systems. I think going through our kind of physics education, I don't know if everyone's seen this, but you can look at the energy structure of a lithium atom, right? You have these well-defined energy levels, and you look at a molecule. So, well, now it has rotation and vibrational states, kind of filling in between the electronic states. Now you throw another lithium atom in there, those rho vibrational states gets denser, and as it gets more and more dense, eventually you get a chunk of lithium that just has band structures, right? So I see molecules or clusters as really the bridge between these two regimes. And there's sort of a very wide range of complexities you can pick when you work with molecules. You can start with something as innocent looking as a diatomic molecule, go to something that has a few more atoms, or you can study a buckyball, right? So you get a lot of options. And over the past few decades, there has been a really strong push in the quantum information science community or AMO physics community in general to make the molecules look more like an atom, right? So we want to control all the different degrees of freedom inside as much as possible, such that they behave as our favorite two-level systems. So you might say, okay, so with diatomics and the few atom molecules, it's conceivable to make them look more like an atom, but what about a C60 like this? Or if you talk to Junyi, he would tell you that a C60 is nothing but a 60-qubit quantum computer. All right. So molecules for QIS. So far, it just sounds like atoms with extra steps, right? But molecules does give you some advantages over atoms in the sense that they have these extra degrees of freedom, right? It has vibration, has rotation, and it has interactions between their nuclear spins and other angular momentums within that molecule. And these are good for different things. So the vibrational degree of freedom provides a good platform to measure fundamental constants, such as the possible variation of proton to electron mass ratio. And the vibrational energy depends both on the mass of the proton and how strong the electron is binding it. So that MP over ME comes naturally out of that. The rotational degree of freedom, it sort of gives molecule this spatial alignment property, where if you have two diatomic molecules while aligned in space, and each of them has a dipole moment, then they can interact with each other through that dipolar interaction, right? There's a kind of similar effort in atoms where you drive these atoms to highly excited Rydberg states and use the dipole interaction from there to mediate that interaction. But you get this kind of four molecules that are near the ground state. Of course, there's the spin degree of freedom, where if you're looking purely at nuclear spin, they don't really interact with the environment very much. So these are good for long-term storage of quantum information. Okay. And with those advantages, in the last few years, there has been really amazing progress in using molecules for quantum information science applications. For example, last year we had this new result on the constraint on the electron-electric dipole moment from the JILA EDM experiments. And here they're working with hafnium fluoride plus molecular ion, using the internal electric field in that molecular ion to make the very stringent measurement of the possible electron-electric dipole moment. You can also think of these molecules as just spins. You can put them in a lattice, and they interact through their dipolar interaction, and you can build your favorite spin model out of that for quantum simulation applications. Or you can put these molecules in tweezers and have them, interact with each other still through the dipolar interaction. You can, use them as qubits to build quantum simulators or quantum computers. And these are all experiments realized within the last year. So it is a good time to be alive, to be working in the field of ultracold molecules. All right, so what I'm interested in is sort of leveraging the advances in these AMO and QIS techniques to try to better understand molecular dynamics. The general mission of my lab is to understand and control these dynamics at the quantum mechanical level. And what I mean by molecular dynamics is given by this example. Say we have a group of atoms that are arranged in some configuration known as reactants. And we launch these together so they can collide and scatter off of each other. And they're going to form either a transition state or intermediate complex. And after a while, they're going to dissociate into products or return back to reactants. So if the interaction results in not sufficient energy to form the products, then we just get the reactants form these complexes and going back. This is what we call a collision. And if there is enough energy, then it has both options. But if there's a lot of extra energy to form the products, then that becomes the favorable pathway. So we call that a chemical reaction. But collisions and reactions should really be thought of under the same unifying framework. And now if I put my physicist hat on and I think about this problem, the way I would approach this is to treat it as a scattering problem, right? Where you have some quantum states for the reactants, and the interaction between these particles, which involve nuclei and electrons, they're guided by some Hamiltonian. So you propagate the reactant state through that Hamiltonian, you get some products. And that's what I mean by studying chemical reaction. So we want to understand what the Hamiltonian is, and we understand how does dynamics evolve according to it. All right, so a good way to kind of examine molecular dynamics is to use the so-called potential energy surface treatment, where you can make the so-called Born-Oppenheimer approximation, where you assume that the electrons in these atoms are so much lighter compared to the nuclei, such that you can treat these two problems separately. You can calculate the electronic energy for the system at different nuclear coordinates, and you plot it out. And that's what you see plotted here. You have the electronic energy as a function of different nuclear coordinates. Right? And once you have that electronic energy, the rest of the problem is just to launch your nuclei on this energy and solve the Schrodinger equation involving this electronic potential for the nuclei dynamics. So, for a reaction that has this kind of potential energy surface, you can imagine launching it in from one end. That's the reactants. It goes through some transition states, and it launches out as products. And if we follow the reaction along this minimum energy path, sort of the path of least resistance, then what you get is a 1D cut. This is called a reaction energy diagram. I think many of us have seen this in our chemistry textbook, right? Except they never tell you what the reaction coordinate is. And I dare you to ask your chemistry professor next time, what is the reaction coordinate, and watch them freeze. But here is a very quantitative definition of what a reaction coordinate is, right? So if you look at the 1D, you start out with some energy. It goes through a transition state at either higher or lower energy, all right? So if it's higher in energy than the reactants, then we say the reaction has a barrier. And at the top, we call that a transition state. And if it is lower than the reactant energy, we say that it forms a complex, a collisional complex. But eventually, if the product is lower in energy, you'll be able to get out into products. All right. So this is sort of the picture I want to impose upon you about looking at molecular dynamics. And now I want to give a little bit of a history behind it. There's been a really rich history in studying molecular dynamics, both from the physics and chemistry communities. So in physics, for example, in the 80s, at MIT, in a group of Dave Pritchard, there's been this series of papers that look at how rotational and vibrational energy quenches in collisions between diatomic molecules and other molecules or other atoms. On the chemistry side, in the sort of 1960s to 80s, there's been a lot of activity in studying chemical reactions in a so-called cross-molecular beam experiment, where you take two reactants and you prepare a molecular beam for each one of them, and you launch them at each other. And at the region of intersection, they can react, they can scatter out of each other. And you look at the way the product scatters out, right? So the way the product scatters out tells you something about the reaction that happened earlier. And the 1986 Nobel Prize was awarded to these three gentlemen, Dolly Hirschbach, Y.T. Lee, and John Polanyi, for their contribution in studying chemical reactions using this kind of apparatus. All right, so, the thing I also want to emphasize is that reaction dynamics is a high complexity problem, right? So if we think about even for a simple chemical reaction, there are many nuclei involved and even more electrons involved, right? So solving that electronic structure problem and solving the nuclear dynamics problem on that potential energy surface, neither of them is a cakewalk, right? And there are sort of problems at the forefront of our both theoretical methods and computational power, right? I'm not talking about any approximate method here. So I'm talking about if you were to write down the Schrodinger equation and solve it exactly, that becomes a very complicated problem in chemistry. And it is the case even for systems of 3 or 4 atoms, right? So like the smallest system size that you can call a chemical reaction. So which means there's a lot of work to do in this arena. But if you think about the nuclear dynamics across a potential energy surface, we want to understand what the surface looks like. We understand what the dynamics looks like. But what we have access to in the lab are these reactants and products, right? And the most detailed way you can look at the configuration of the reactants and products is by looking at their individual quantum states. So experimentally, I can prepare my reactants in some well-defined quantum state, and I can measure what quantum state the reaction partitions the flux into the different product states, right? So I get this mapping, and I can ask people smarter than myself to do a theory calculation of the same thing. So I tell them, run this calculation with the reactants in a particular state. They build up this Hamiltonian, they run a scattering matrix calculation, and they come up with the distribution of product quantum states. And we're going to compare notes, right? So this throw this in just to prove I'm, trained as a physicist. And yes, which we should all be trained in. Notice the feedback goes to the theory, right? So speaks to the level of confidence in our measurements. But these are very difficult theories. So a small amount of deviation, Jacek in the audience here, he's one of the smart theorists I'm referring to. Even a small amount of deviations in the accuracy of your potential and the dynamics could result in very different distributions of the product states. In other words, there's a lot of synergy between experiments and theory in the field of molecular dynamics. So this is typically what we refer to as state-to-state chemistry. Now we're really looking at these chemical processes on the level of individual quantum states of the reactants and products. Yes. So is there a question? Yes, I can take questions. Yeah.
Like if I think about the chemical reactions in real life,
yeah.
I have thought that's kind of both energy and entropy. So why is it okay to think of it as a Hamiltonian, versus what is the effect of that?
Very good. This is my physicist spherical cow mentality coming into play.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Oh, sorry. So the question is, when we typically look at chemical reactions, we typically think in terms of kind of thermodynamic variables like energy, entropy, enthalpy, things like that. So why is it sufficient for me to just think of the quantum states and their energies in this case? Right? So the answer is we're looking at chemical reactions one collisional event at a time, right? So the reason why you need to look at kind of thermodynamic variables in real chemistry is that things happen in ensemble. And there's no clean separation of reactants and products, right? For example, let's imagine a single collision event. The product comes out. As soon as it comes out, it runs into another molecule in your beaker, and the quantum state is gone, right? So that means there's no hope in getting state-to-state information. So all you have are these macroscopic observables. So does that answer your question? All right, thank you.
Maybe I could insert a question here too.
Yes.
So this slide talks about the complexity of 3 or 4 atom systems, and you were saying that these represented the minimum for something that that really would be called chemistry. I'm just wondering why you exclude the kind of reaction that might collide 2 atoms, typically with a photon, and turn into a diatomic molecule. That's so you're excluding that from what you call chemistry. Is that so you can keep your bona fides as a chemist?
No, you're absolutely right, Bill. So actually, a kind of a broader definition for chemistry is that the group of things you call reactants and the group of things you call products should look different. And the photochemical reaction that you described, where you got 2 things colliding and a photon gets emitted, and that takes away the binding energy, so it forms a deeply bound molecule, that completely qualifies as a chemical reaction. I think sort of 2-body reactions like that are relatively well understood. But the 3 or 4 atom problems are sort of pushing the limit of our ability to describe them exactly using quantum mechanical theory.
Okay. I'm surprised that you got this far without quoting what Art Shallow said about diatomic molecules.
That's right.
Right?
So the quote Bill is referring to is Arthur Shallow once said, a diatomic molecule is 1 atom too many, I think, right?
Exactly. It's a molecule with 1 atom too many, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So that I should have said that in the complexity slide. So thank you for adding that in, Bill.
Thanks.
But by the way, I thought, I was thinking like everybody quotes him for saying that, but I don't know if it's just one of those things where it just gets mistakenly attributed because everyone says that you said it. So I actually had to look it up. There is a American. He did say. Oh, he did say. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, great.
I know. I actually asked him about that. What he didn't say, which is often attributed to him, is that the laser was a solution looking for a problem.
I got you. All right. So where are we? So, we want to look at chemistry on a quantum state-to-state level. So we want this kind of, to be able to realize this experimentally, as you might imagine, is challenging. We know that in real-world chemistry, things look more like a Boltzmann distribution with states smeared across a very large phase space rather than a simple clean initial state like that. So if you launched a Boltzmann distribution into a reaction, you get another Boltzmann distribution out, or get some other statistical distribution out, then the hope to understand the intricacies of what's going on the potential energy surface diminishes, right? And as we intuitively know, when you start averaging over things, the sort of quantum mechanical nature of reactions starts to be averaged out as well. So what we really want is to be able to put things in a single quantum state. And for that, we need ultracold molecules. So this is my one slide on a diatomic molecule and its various degrees of freedoms placed on a temperature scale, right? So one thing that people work with molecules often tout is that it has different degrees of freedom that corresponds to different energy scales, and those are good for different things. So at the highest end, we have the electronic energy. That's the energy that binds the molecule together. That's sitting at about a few thousand to tens of thousands of Kelvin. And then a little bit lower, we have the molecular vibration, which is from a few hundred to a few thousand Kelvin. Rotation is from single kelvins to hundreds of Kelvin. And then further down, even finer scale, we have the hyperfine interaction. And I'm using hyperfine sort of loosely. This just means interactions between the different angular momentum degrees of freedom in the molecule. And that's sitting, anywhere from a few tens of microkelvin to a few Kelvin. But even at towards single microkelvin regime, we still have another degrees of freedom. That's the orbital degree of freedom. So this is where we describe the collisional motion between two molecules when they collide. These are typically quantized into SPDF partial waves. And in order to get to a regime where we're able to control all of these different quantum numbers, including that partial wave, we need to be as cold as a microkelvin. And this is laser cooling temperatures, right? You can try very hard with traditional chemistry methods, but that's just not going to get you below like the Kelvin range. And we want to be 6 orders of magnitude lower. Okay, so
Now, could I ask
yes,
a couple of questions about this scale?
yes,
Now, if you had a triatomic molecule, heaven forbid, then you would have additional
two
degrees
atoms,
of freedom like bending. Where
yes,
does bending fall in this hierarchy?
a very good question.
And is it even important as far as you're concerned?
So all degrees of freedom are important. And the bending would fall somewhere in between rotation and vibrational energy scales for a diatomic.
Okay.
So you can consider it either as a really weak vibrational mode or as a really strong rotational mode.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, so you bring up partial waves.
Yes.
Of course, that's one of the criterion for being ultra cold in, say, collision of two atoms. We would say, well, if I can get down to the S wave regime or resonant P wave or whatever, depending on the nature, then that puts me into the ultra cold. Things are rather more complicated if you're describing the sort of thing you've been talking about, where you have reaction surfaces. So what I'm
Right.
wondering is, when you've got a reaction surface, something that can suck these molecules into other states that they can come out, how important is the quantum nature of the collision from the partial wave point of view, as opposed to the sort of classical thing that we would typically think of chemistry being as some kind of a trajectory on a reaction surface, as you invited us to consider when talking about the Born-Oppenheimer approximation.
So that's also a very good question. So the partial wave picture is most relevant when you're in a long-range part of the potential, where you can effectively think of these molecules just as point particles, and everything you would use to describe two atoms colliding would translate well into describing molecular collisions as well. The trouble, as you mentioned, is when they start getting sucked into kind of deeper parts of that potential energy surface, and all the partial waves start mixing. There, it would seem like it would make more sense to look at it more from a classical lens. But I want to emphasize that the wave function nature of the nuclei in that picture is still important, in that people have observed quantum interference effects of kind of reactions taking different trajectories on a potential energy surface. Right? So quasi-classical trajectory, it gets you pretty far as telling you what the molecular dynamics is. But if you're at the sort of temperatures that we're at, and you really have the ability to look at how things happen on a state-to-state level, then the wave function nature of these nuclei starts to play a role.
Okay, so what you're telling us is that if you're really quantum to begin with, that is, you're cold enough that you're in a single row vibrational, whatever, hyperfine state, then it's likely that you're going to have to use a quantum mechanical treatment of everything in order to get the interference right.
Correct.
Sorry to interrupt, but these sound like really fascinating discussions for a longer meeting.
Okay, sorry.
We want to give you time to actually tell us about what he's working on.
Right, sorry.
No, thank you, Bill. Be happy to talk to you more about this. This is the sort of temperature scale we're working against, right? We want to be at the far right end of this, and this requires all the wonderful techniques that we in ultra cold atoms community are familiar with, including laser cooling and evaporative cooling. So let's say I want to laser cool my molecule. For most molecules, that's just not possible. We run into a problem of photon cycling, right? So laser cooling requires whatever you're cooling to be able to cycle a large number of photons. And by cycling, what I mean is, you can drive a transition repeatedly across the two levels. But for a molecule, it doesn't play nice like that. If you start from a particular, let's say the ground state of a molecule, and you excite it to some electronically excited state, there's no selection rule on the vibrational transitions. So it's just going to decay to whatever vibrational state that has wave function overlap with that initial, with that excited state, right? So this is this causes a problem for photon cycling, because if you have 1,000 vibrational states to decay into, I don't think it's practical to ask for 1,000 lasers, 1,000 repumpers to inject that photon back into your cooling cycle. Okay, but nevertheless, people have been able to find certain molecules that behave more like two-level atoms, in that the ground and electronic surface looks similar enough such that when you do an electronic excitation, it decays primarily in 95 to 99% back to that original state, and with smaller probability to higher excited vibrational states. And there you can get away with maybe a dozen repumpers, right? No big deal. So you would do laser cooling in a very similar fashion as you would laser cool atoms in this case. There's another approach to getting ultra-cold molecules, is you start with atoms that you can laser cool, pick your favorite atoms, and you want to make a molecule out of it. You would just do laser cooling on the two species of atoms that comprise that molecule separately. And you would do a coherent assembly of these atoms into molecules. So you'd first do a Feshbach resonance to magnetically associate the two atoms into a very weakly bound molecule called a Feshbach molecule. And then you would take a Raman laser and transfer it to whatever deeply bound molecular state that you want to. And you can have selectivity of all the quantum numbers, vibrational, rotational, hyperfine, you name it. This was first done by Concurrent when she was at Gila in collaboration with Paul Julian. Okay. So now comes the part that I tell you about my research. And I'm going to go relatively quickly. I think it's more important for us to talk about ultra-cold molecules than for me to talk in detail about my results. So, but you're always welcome to ask me questions about them. So part one is going to be the stuff that I did at Harvard with Concurrent, where we studied this particular chemical reaction, KRB plus KRB, going through intermediate complex K2RB2, eventually forming products, K2 and RB2. So this particular project, we, as you can tell, we picked a molecule that comprised of laser-cooled atoms, right? So this is how we make these KRB molecules. We laser cool K and RB separately. We photoassociate them. All right. So part two is going to be my postdoc results at NIST, where we were able to track and control the quantum state of a single molecular ion in an ion trap. So both of these sort of fall within the storyline of looking at chemical reactions or molecular dynamics in general at the state-to-state level. All right, so this is what my lab looked like at Harvard. It looks a lot more similar to the JQI labs than it is to a typical chemistry lab. So with that, we studied this chemical reaction, as I mentioned. So we have the two KRB molecules. We were able to prepare them in a single well-defined quantum states. Here, V is vibrational quantum number, N is rotational quantum number. We also specify their nuclear spin quantum number, but I just didn't label it here. And after they come together, they immediately fall into this very deep well of the complex. The complex is a lot lower in energy, about 3,000 wave numbers lower in energy than the reactants. And it can form products, K2 and RB2, and those are about 10 wave numbers lower in energy compared to your reactants. So we wanted to look at the products on a quantum state resolved level. So the states that we had to deal with are these rotational states of K2 and RB2. It turns out 10 wave numbers is not enough to populate any vibrational states. You need something like 100 or a few hundred wave numbers for that. So we can only populate rotational states. For 10 wave numbers, I can populate, rotational state of K2 up to 12 and RB2 up to 20. So if I
Question.
Yes, Ian,
What's
sorry.
the wave number?
So one wave number is 30 gigahertz. Yeah. Sorry, I usually have a Rosetta Stone for different units because I give talks to different audiences. But thank you for asking that question. Yeah. So if I want to look at the probability of the product forming in these different channels, I got to have a way to state selectively detect these channels. So the method I use is something pretty common in both molecular physics and chemistry. It's called REMPI, resonantly enhanced multi-photon ionization, where I can take the product from whatever quantum state they emerge in and resonantly excite it using a CW narrow line laser. For RB2 and K2, these fall within the 600 to 700 nanometer range. Once I excite it, I can ionize that excited product. So I turn it into an ion, and then I can count that with my ion detector. So, because K2 and RB2 are not things that you can cycle photon on, I don't just get to do fluorescent detection like we usually do here. Okay, but nevertheless, with this REMPI technique, we're able to make a map of the probability of K2 and RB2 product states. So this, staring at this, we see the x-axis is the rotational quantum number, the y-axis is the strength or the signal strength, how likely it is for the product to form there. And we see that for K2, only the even quantum numbers are occupied. And for RB2, only the odd quantum numbers are occupied. This actually has a kind of deep reason coming from the exchange symmetry of fermionic versus bosonic nuclei, where if you want to describe the total wave function of a nucleus, I need to tell you the rotational state, the rotational wave function, and the spin wave function, the wave function of the nuclear spin. And if I have K2, which is, K is we use the fermionic potassium, that makes its nucleus bosonic, right? So a bosonic nucleus has to have a totally symmetric spatial wave function. So the product of these two guys has to be symmetric. Sorry, clicked the wrong button here. Right, so the product of these two wave functions has to be symmetric, which means if I have a, even spin state, then I need to give you an even rotational quantum number. So in this particular case, we did have an even spin for the K2 nucleus. So it can only occupy even rotational states. But the opposite is true for RB2, and RB87 is a boson, right? So I get only odd rotational states here. So this is nothing too interesting about this. What was interesting is that if we drop the magnetic field under which the reaction is happening from 30 Gauss to 5 Gauss, right? So I forgot to mention that, this previous measurement was done at a 30 Gauss magnetic field. If we drop that to 5 Gauss, then we see that both even and odd states are not allowed to be occupied. And the same is true for K2. I just don't have a picture to show you. Yes?
Does the magnetic field change the depth of that potential well?
So very negligibly. The Zeeman shift for nucleus is like kind of on the order of kilohertz per Gauss, and that's 30 gigahertz times 3,000. So like, yeah, very, very large energy difference. But thank you for that question. So then, with the drop in magnetic field, we see that the both even and odd states are now occupied. And we're able to attribute this change to the fact that the nuclear spins, whatever nuclear spins KRB had was unchanged throughout all the chaos of the chemical reaction. So the reason behind that is when we have the 30 Gauss case, we can prepare the KRBs in a sort of nuclear spin state where it is well defined by the projection quantum number, right? So the spins on the K and RB are pretty well aligned to the external magnetic field, and the coupling between them is not as important. So we're in the, forgot the term for the regime. We have the Zeeman regime. We have, is that Paschen-Beck? Yeah, we're in the Paschen-Beck regime. So, when the products come out, they have to inherit those well-aligned nuclear spins. And when they're in these kind of nuclear spin states that have well-defined symmetry, that restricts the rotational wave function symmetry and gives us this parity selection of the rotational quantum numbers. But if I drop my magnetic field, the nuclear spin still remains conserved, except, now we're in a Zeeman regime where I have to write it as a superposition of different magnetic sublevels. And what that means is that the nuclear spin wave function loses that perfect even or odd symmetry, and that starts to allow both even and odd rotational states to contribute to the reaction products. All right, so let's see. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go through this next part very quickly. So next, we wanted to look at this kind of state-to-state reaction in a little bit more detail. For that, we recognize that just knowing the rotational state of either K2 or RB2 is not sufficient, because these are correlated things coming out of the reaction. So what I really want is to know, for a K2 molecule that comes out in a particular rotational state, what is the RB2 molecule that pairs up with that state. So in other words, I'm looking at the joint probability of scattering into pairwise rotational states of these two products. And we wanted to do a map of that with that level of details. So this kind of shows you the energetically allowed states given my 10 wave number of exothermic energy for this reaction. And the red squares here mark the product channels that obey the even odd symmetry rule restricted by nuclear spin conservation. So the sort of most simple picture I can describe the outcome of this kind of reaction is to say that, okay, so the potential well is so deep here that whatever incoming flux is just going to be evenly mixed into all the allowed modes within that intermediate complex. And as the complex comes out in terms of products, that well-mixed sort of ergodic reaction flux is going to evenly partition into the different allowed product channels, right? So the probability of scattering into a given product channel is just equal to its degeneracy. How many sublevels are there in that product channel? And this is called the statistical theory, right? It assumes complete mixing of a reaction flux among different degrees of freedoms and equal partition into product channels. So if I do the counting of the degeneracy of these different pairwise rotational states, then I get this picture. States that have large rotational quantum numbers tends to have more degeneracy. This just is related to the fact that we have sort of more rotational quantum number, and there are more Zeeman states or more projection states associated with it. Okay, so now we wanted to make a measurement experimentally. What we do is we still use ionization to state selectively detect K2 and RB2 products, but instead of doing them separately, we do them at the same time. So we do a simultaneous Rampey excitation. And then we fly the ions to an ion detector that records both the position and timing for these product ions. And on here, we can look at an ion scattering map, right? So on this position-sensitive detector, what we're looking at, each blue dot is an RB2 ion, and connected with each blue dot is a gray line to a red ion, K2. Right? So they're different in time of flight. The heavier masses would arrive at the detector a little later than the lighter ones, but thank you. So here we're looking at kind of pairs of products that emerged out of the same reaction event, right? And we were able to select these out from all the different, individual product signals by requiring that there is momentum conservation between the K2 and RB2 as they fly out of this reaction. So we use that to gate or screen the ions that come from the same reaction event that falls to a particular pair of product channels. Okay, and this is what we come up with, right? This is what we measure. It took us 2 months to measure this. We just had the machine running 24/7 during COVID. If the grad students here need a motivation to build your system very robustly, this is a good reason. Okay, so then the question is, how does this compare with our statistical model? Well, here's the comparison. So instead of plotting it in a two-dimensional color map, here I've just plotted in one-dimensional formats where for each plot is a particular rotational state of K2 and all the RB2 rotational state that can pair up with that K2. The darker colored bar is our statistical model, and the lighter colored bar is our experimental measurement. So we see that, if we just kind of stare at this at a very high level, it looks like the overall agreement is not too bad, right? So it does look like our statistical model more or less describes what's going on in our chemical reaction. But we had to, zoom in on outliers, right? We had to see basically how well agreed these models really are from a statistical point of view. So we did a p-value test that shows us 50 state pairs out of 57 total channels shows populations that are consistent with our statistical model. And the outliers are shown here with the red arrows. There's a particularly egregious outlier, this state NK2 equal to 12 and RB2 equal to 7. We think we have a good understanding of why these two, the model and the statistical model and the experiment disagree so much, is the fact that as the product comes out, they also experience centrifugal potentials, right? As they come out of the reaction, they need to be able to break from their mutual centrifugal potential in order to escape into the long range as free products. So we did a calculation, and it turns out for that particular product channel, if we look at all the centrifugal potentials associated with the different product partial waves, we see that the collisional energy that product has to escape out of the reaction, which is very small, mind you. So this product barely has enough energy to make out of that reaction. That actually gets stopped by those potential barriers pretty strongly. There's a little bit of tunneling, but it's really not that much. But most of it just reflects back into that complex. So it needs to try again to be able to come out of the reaction. So that's why experimentally we see so much lower product formation than what the degeneracy of that state is supposed to tell us it should be. Okay, so for all the other outliers, we do not suffer from this long-range potential. These are pretty weak potential in the grand scheme of things. So the fact that they don't agree points to some sort of dynamical effects in the reaction, right? So this is the dynamics that we're interested in. When things differ from a completely ergodic statistical model, it means there are some dynamical effects that leads to that difference. So what are those differences? I have no idea. Yes, sorry.
Like you said that like these differences were significant at the level of like individual. Like I'm focusing on that data point.
Yeah.
But if I look at the collection, I do expect to have some things that diverge more from agreement than others. So at that level, is this number of disagreements like significant?
So in order for us to, so like the p-value test is you take a ensemble of all your results and you slowly remove numbers of entries from that ensemble. You remove the largest outliers until your model is in good statistical agreement with the model, right? And what we're able to show is that if we take 7 of our results, 7 bars from our sample, if we throw those away, then we get agreements. Right? So that's sort of the quantitative statement on how well these two things behave, how well these two things agree with each other.
Let me ask us a related question.
Yes, Bill.
If I look at the upper left-hand panel, the NK2 equals 0.
Yes.
Sure enough, the N rubidium 2 equals 1 looks off, but the statistical model has everything being exactly the same. And if I look at that, it doesn't look like everything is exactly the same. That so for example, 7, 9, 11, 13, the experiments are all above the statistical model. In
Right.
fact, almost everything's above the statistical model except for one. And even though that doesn't fit into your outlier model, I would be really suspicious of that picture.
Absolutely. So the take-home message is we should be suspicious of the statistical model because clearly it is not in statistical agreement with our measurements, right? I think those didn't get removed in our outlier tests because they're like 1 or within 1 sigma away from the result, where some of the ones with smaller error bars, they're just more sigmas away from the actual statistical
Right,
model.
exactly. Yeah. But they're all above. That's the thing that
Yes.
makes them stand out.
That's right. That's right. So there's definitely something going on there, right?
Okay.
So the point I want to make is that there is some level of agreement, but the disagreement is sort of the more interesting thing here, right? But in order to understand the disagreement, we need a theoretical model that allows me to calculate. So this model right now is statistical, right? Everything being equal. But what I need is a model to calculate the exact dynamics that's happened during the KRB plus KRB reaction. And for that, we just don't have the model yet. If any theorist is hiding that model, I would be very interested to know. But as far as I know, for 4 pretty heavy atoms right now, we just can't do exact quantum dynamical calculations on them. Right? But for any sort of future theories that want to tackle this problem, we have created a very clean set of benchmarks to compare notes with. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Bill. So in the interest of time, I am going to just sort of skip over the postdoc stuff. And I want to spend the last 5-10 minutes to talk about my plans at Maryland. Come on. I have way too many animations. I think it's the problem. So let's, all right. Okay, so let's go to the acknowledgement slide first. So both my PhD work and postdoc work would not be possible without the good people that I work with. So I don't have time to thank everyone, but I'll just list a few. So this is the Harvard NEAT group, and this is the NIST ion storage group. The PIs are James Chow and Didi Leifrid on the project that I didn't get a chance to talk about. Okay, so now I want to spend a little time talking about the experiments I'm planning here at Maryland. So as I mentioned, the general theme of my lab would be to study molecular dynamics at these quantum mechanical levels, at the state-to-state level. And it's funny, after I gave my job talk on this KRB plus KRB experiment to the chemistry department, had a conversation with Millard Alexander. Some of you might know Millard. He's a theoretical chemist specialized in calculating these very difficult electronic structure and nuclear dynamics problem. And Jacek is a longtime collaborator of Millard's. And he said, oh, why don't you do lithium? Like, you know, KRB is so heavy, I can't do any calculation with it. Why don't you do lithium? And I didn't have the heart to tell Millard how difficult it is for us to switch out the ultracold species that we're studying. But here at Maryland, I have an opportunity to remedy that, right? So this really comes out of a conversation with Millard. So I want to set up an experiment to examine ultracold chemical reactions involving lithium atoms and their molecules, right? So in the simplest sense, we have these 2 different isotopes of lithium, right? We have lithium 6 and 7. And I can make 3 different kinds of molecules out of those. So I can make a lithium 6 dimer, a lithium 7 dimer, and a interspecies dimer, right? And I can do this with the well-developed Feshbach resonance plus stirrup transfer technique that I mentioned earlier. By the way, this is the reason I love being at Maryland is I talked to Paul Julian about my need to find a Feshbach resonance between these two different isotopes. And he said, oh, I just have the code for you to do this. I just need to plug in the masses. I was like, fantastic. And if I want to look at chemical reactions, there are 3 exothermic reactions, meaning energy releasing reactions I can look at. One is this reaction between a lithium atom and a lithium-6 dimer. This one, it's just a simple atom exchange reaction, releases about 200 gigahertz of energy. I switch my units to gigahertz. And we can have a similar reaction where we just, reaction between lithium-7 atom and the 6-7 interspecies dimer. This one releases a similar amount, about 200 gigahertz as well. And by the way, why am I interested in isotopes? It's because I want a way to distinguish the reactants and products, right? So if I have a reaction that involves just 3 lithium atoms of the same isotope flavor, then I can't tell on my ion detector whether an lithium-6 or lithium ion comes from the reactants or products. But if I have a unique isotopic or unique mass associated with each of my reactant and product molecules and atoms, then I can tell all of these apart in time of flight. Okay, so the special thing about these reactions is that the number of exit channels is very small, right? So if I start this reaction in a low vibrational ground state, then 200 gigahertz is only going to populate about 3 rotational states, right? So with KRB, we have 57 rotational states to look at. Here is just 3. So makes things a lot simpler. The same for this reaction. And on the more complicated side, we can also study the reaction between 2 diatomic lithium-6 and 7 molecules. And those would exchange partners to form lithium-6 and lithium-7 dimers. And the exothermicity is even smaller, right? We got only about 8 gigahertz of exothermicity. So everything comes out in the absolute ground state of the products. But of course, we can also put the reactants into highly excited states, more highly excited internal states, to be able to play with look at other quantum states of the products. But by the way, you only get a difference in the energy between these different combinations due to the 0-point energy difference between the 6 and 7 atoms. Okay, so with this experiment, the possible scientific directions I'm interested in exploring are the following. So one idea that's been a holy grail in the field of molecular dynamics is something called coherent control, where you ask the question, if I scatter the reactants in some particular states into the reaction, I get a certain product distribution. Can I use a clever combination of reactant states, a superposition of states with well-defined phases, to be able to control how the products form, right? Which quantum states they form? Can I funnel all the reaction flux into a single product state and not other product quantum states, right? This is where we can leverage the principles of quantum interference to constructively interfere these reactants into this channel and not at all into other channels. So to what degree can we do this? This is something that I'm interested in looking at. In chemistry, in these complex forming reactions, some take a very simple trajectory. So it's just in and out, right? Very quick. But some really take their time. They just like wander around in that complex form for on and on and on, and find its way out after a really long time. We have some understanding of what makes a difference between these two scenarios, but so far there hasn't been a systematic study in a single system where you can just vary the initial condition of a reaction and be able to smoothly tune between these two different behaviors. So that's another front that I'm interested in exploring. Thirdly, this idea where when products come out of a reaction, they don't come out as individual products, but rather they come out in entangled quantum states where all different combinations of the allowed product channels are in that entangled wave function, right? In principle, that's what we expect out of a quantum mechanical process, but so far nobody has really been able to measure this quantum entangled nature of the products. I think this is a very challenging thing. You need to somehow capture these products and do some sort of parity oscillation measurements. But this is sort of something that we're interested in exploring further down the road. And finally, we've been able to assemble two atoms into molecules. But what is to say I can't just kind of keep going, right? Can I take an atom and a dimer, assemble it into a trimer? And can I do a trimer into a tetramer, so on and so forth? Can I use this principle of magneto-association and stirrup to always get it to a well-defined quantum state for these increasingly larger clusters? And I think lithium is a particularly good system to study all of these because of its simplicity, right? It's both experimentally, it's a relatively well-developed species in terms of laser cooling and other cooling techniques. Theoretically, the light mass of lithium makes the problems a lot more tractable than something like a KRB. Okay, so with that, I think it's a good time for me to stop. There is a second experiment, but you can ask me about it in the questions or later on if you're interested. So I just want to show you a picture of the new lab in chemistry. So this is our new wing of the chemistry building that you see slowly go up over the last couple of years. And I'm located in a sub-basement of that building. And this is the picture of the lab I took last week. And we have a couple grad students already signed on, bravely signed on to do all the work. So we have Jin Chen from chemical physics program, Soup from chemistry, and Sarat, who just joined us last week, also from chemical physics. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and take any questions.
Thank you very much. Let me ask the first question since I have it for.
All right.
There we go. So you mentioned an interest in quantum information, quantum
Yes.
computing. Of those four, how can you pull that together?
Oh, good question. So there's general interest in the field about, application of molecules in like kind of more traditionally quantum information science applications like computing and simulation, right? So my sort of interest is always more on the molecular dynamics side. Like I just want to understand how scatterings work. But there is some relevance to the whole field of quantum information science. In particular, this idea of looking at quantum entanglement between reaction products, right? These are entangled things that fly out of a reaction, in different directions. Can we do something with that? Are these sort of like a chemist flying qubits, if you would? So there's some application there. With the assembly of ultracold clusters, you can also think about the possibility of gaining quantum control over increasingly more complicated systems. And you can use the extra degree of freedoms in those systems to allow you to do like fancier encoding of your qubits, for example. Yes.
Can you tell us that slide that you skipped ion neutron?
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking. All right, so I do have a second experiment planned. And this is sort of my response to a reaction I get sometimes from talking to people that I do chemical reactions with alkali atoms. It's like, who cares, right? But hopefully we care, right? Like alkali atoms are nothing special, but to a physicist, no chemical reaction is special, right? What we want to understand is the quantum mechanics behind those chemical reactions. And for that, I'll just pick whatever system I can get the best control of. That's why I do lithium and KRB. But I do also want to diversify the sort of my profile a little bit and be able to get other species that are not conducive to AMO techniques or laser cooling in particular to cold and ultra cold temperatures. So the idea is to generate cold and ultra cold neutral atoms without laser cooling, but rather generate them through photodissociation of sympathetically cooled molecular ions. And you see this is a very mouthful thing to say, so I highlighted cold neutrals and cooled molecular ions. So as I mentioned earlier, one barrier to molecular cooling is this photon cycling problem, right? But that only applies to neutral molecules, right? translational cooling of molecular ions is like stupidly simple because it has a charge. You can just throw a ionized molecule into an ion trap where you have other laser cooled atoms trapped in there, right? And by doing laser cooling on these cold trapped atoms, you get sympathetic cooling of the molecular ions. So you get translational cooling of molecular ions really easily. And from that point, what you can do is you can take a molecular ion and you can state selectively zap it into an ion fragment and a neutral fragment, right? So you can do a dissociation that's so close to threshold such that it doesn't introduce additional energy to your system. And you get a neutral that inherits that temperature of the molecular ion in the ion trap. So this is sort of a cartoon, shows you you can get a CH3 radical out of that. But you can also think about something that's more relevant to physics applications, such as a single hydrogen atom, right? People want to have ultra-cold hydrogens for a very long time now for precision measurement purposes. But laser cooling on hydrogen requires wavelengths so UV that we don't even want to think about it. But this is sort of my roundabout way of possibly getting to ultra-cold hydrogen without laser cooling. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes.
The next thing, you're talking about simple versus complex.
Yep.
It seems, at least to me, it feels like if you have a complex dynamic, you might forget what the original chip is.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
how can you tune that?
Right.
Because obviously, if your action is only ever complex, then there's no real point in playing with it.
That's right. That's a very good question. So the other reason I picked lithium is that we believe that we have the ability to tune it between these two extremes. So lithium, so the complexity of the trajectory is in some ways related to the density of state of your collisional complex. So how many different rotational vibrational states are supported in that potential well, right? And as you might imagine, the density of state goes up if you have a deeper well or if you have heavier particles. So for KRB, it's just horrendous. There's like the density of state is so high that when the KRB molecules come into the reaction, they do not see resolved resonances, but they just see a blur. But for lithium, at least for example, at MIT, where Wolfgang Ketterle's lab is working with a lithium sodium molecule, they were able to see resolved collisional resonances even with two molecules, right? So by picking a light atom, you really have the opportunity to look at the system where the collisional trajectory is hopefully relatively simple, where this kind of coherent control idea is at least feasible. Thank you.
Well, I think we're getting a little late, so we can ask him some questions.